because everywhere it's going, it's making money. And in our business model, these planes are cash flowing, contributing to overhead about $3,000 an hour.
That's $3,000 that you're charging retail, and or that's the profit margin that you're getting per hour.
$4,000 an hour, charters out at $7,000 an hour. That's a $3,000 an hour margin.
Welcome to the JetLife podcast, pulling back the curtain on private aviation so you can live that jet life to the fullest. My name's Tom Lelyo, and I'm your ultimate jet guide. Hello and welcome to the JetLife podcast. I am joined today by Justin Sullivan of AJAX Jets. I found Justin on YouTube, fellow YouTuber and content creator. Justin, thank you so much for being here. I love the video that you did. How to buy, fly, and invest in a $2 to $3 million jet and make money or something along the lines. It was a great title. I found you there. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today to talk about how individuals can invest in a private jet.
Hey, thanks a million, Tom. Great to be here.
Okay, well, let's talk about, one of the reasons why it might not be a good idea to buy a private jet, Justin, is that it's a depreciating asset. The more you use it, the less valuable it's going to become. Is this really a good idea to be buying a depreciation asset when it comes to an investment?
So I think it's great to start off with really what we do, and what we're doing is helping owners acquire assets that are fully depreciated or mostly depreciated. So we're talking about a Falcon 50, a 9-seat super mid-sized jet with coast-to-coast range that has an acquisition cost of $2 to $3 million, or a Lear 60 mid-sized jet, 3 to 4 hour range that costs $1.5 to $2.5 million. So that $2 to $3 million Falcon 50 would compare with a $25 million Challenger 350, another 9-seat super mid-sized jet. And obviously somebody else has taken that depreciation hit. So in today's very frothy charter market, where I wouldn't say it's easy, Tom, to put 1,000 hours a year of charter revenue on an airplane, but we both know that that's certainly attainable. If you were to take a $25 million Challenger 350, you don't want a guy like me putting 1,000 hours a year on it because you're going to take a huge depreciation hit. But if you're buying a 1985 Falcon 50 that already has 13,000 flight hours on it, and we put 1,000 hours on it, there's not somebody else has taken that depreciation hit, and you're really just living in the cash flows that $1,000 or 1,000 hours a year is generating. And when a Falcon 50 that costs $2 to $3 million is chartering out, believe it or not, at a comparable, not the same rate as a G250 or G280 or a Challenger 350, but certainly the same ballpark with an entirely different ownership strategy. That 1,000 hours a year, when you're not taking a huge depreciation hit, really changes the calculus of an ownership experience. So yeah. I think you're absolutely right. If somebody was most of the people who I talk to, they've dreamt about owning a private jet for years, probably for their whole career. They got on the CEO's private jet 30 years ago and like, man, this is what I want to do. But they're still thinking about, hey, I'm going to get into a Challenger 350, a G650, a Gulfstream G280, maybe a smaller plane like a Phenom 300. Their minds are oriented towards late model planes because that's what they see in the Robb report, and that's what that next CEO that they admire has, and they think, man, that's the way to go. And it certainly takes a bit of, I wouldn't say re-education, but a change in perspective to get that guy to go from investing $25 million in a Challenger 350 to $2 to $3 million in a Falcon 50 that happens to be 35 years older.
What I like about what you're talking about is you're looking at the depreciation, you're giving it context, right? So of course the asset's going to depreciate. You spend $2-3 million, it's going to be worth a little bit less, in a year, 2, 3, 5 years, whatever it is. But when you look at it in a broader context, that plane was a $25 million or whatever plane, back when it originated. So the biggest depreciation hit has already been taken by somebody else, so that even though it is going to depreciate a little bit, it's not going to be as bad when you make the purchase.
Yeah, and more to that point, Tom, the incremental hours that we put on it are not really going to affect that depreciation. Age is a depreciating factor, hours are a depreciating factor, but it's really a different perspective, and maybe your audience would I like to look at things through the lens of cars, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're buying say you're buying a 2022 Aston Martin for $230,000, right? Or a Bentley for $500,000. The way that you're going to treat that vehicle is a certain way. You're going to be very careful about the number of miles that you put on it, because you don't want to take the depreciation hit. You're not going to wear your shoes in your car. It's going to be like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where it's in its own house with lights shining on it, and you're going to rub it with a diaper. And when it comes time to take that car in for service, you're not going to take it anywhere but the Aston Martin dealership or the Bentley dealership to work on it, right? And they're only going to maintain it with factory OEM parts. And the last time I checked, an Aston Martin or Bentley Motors technician bills out at about $325 an hour. And you're buying that car for your own reasons. You're not buying that car to make money, of course. Who makes money with a car? But you're buying it with a certain psychology, and you're obviously a high net worth individual for buying that car, and it's a trophy lifestyle asset, right? Compare that to buying a 2012 Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon for 60 grand. And that G-Wagon, I don't know what they cost new, but say they cost $250,000 brand new if it's an AMG package. So obviously somebody else has taken that depreciation hit before you've bought that vehicle for $60,000. But more to the point, Tom, you've bought that vehicle for your own very specific reasons. You want to save a buck. You could have spent $250,000 on that vehicle, but you chose not to. You chose to spend $60,000 on a vehicle. So you're probably economically oriented or trying to save a buck. And along with that, the way that you would treat that vehicle is very different than if you had bought a 2022 Aston Martin or Bentley. Maybe you don't take your shoes off when you get into it. Maybe you don't care how many miles you're putting on it, so you drive it everywhere you go. And more to the point of private aviation, one of probably the single largest cost center in your ownership experience, certainly at high volumes, 1,000 hours a year, is airframe and engine maintenance, right? So if you're buying a 2012 G-Wagon, you're economically oriented, and you probably don't need to bring that vehicle to the Mercedes-Benz dealership every time it needs the tires rotated or every time the timing belt needs to be changed. You can have a relationship with a local shop who's reputable, who knows how to get non-factory OEM parts at a good rate, and maybe their technicians bill out at $130 an hour. And you know that this import garage does a great job, and you're a good customer of theirs, so they take great care of you. But your cost of ownership is significantly less on a per mile basis than that brand new Aston Martin or Bentley or Mercedes because of the way that you're choosing to maintain it and because of your utilization footprint on it. You're driving it 15,000 miles a year. You're getting 15,000 miles of utility out of it a year, which is, say, that's a lot compared to your brand new car where you're not driving it to Safeway because you don't want to put those 3 miles on it that day, and you're diminishing your so not only is your cost to maintain it higher, pretending that it's not on a factory maintenance program, but that cost that you're paying for maintenance divided by the number of miles gets way out of whack compared to that 2012 G-Wagon because you're driving it more and it's costing you less to maintain it. And when it costs you less divided by how many miles you drive it, that's a great calculus. And that's how we look at a 1990 Falcon 50, right? We can fly it as much as we want, as much as the market will support, which right now is infinite. We both know how the market is for jet charters, in particular a floating fleet of jet charters, right? So getting back to that car analogy, if you've got a $25 million very late model executive jet, you probably want to know where that jet is at all times. It's probably in a hangar at an FBO right by you, and maybe you don't even charter it out, right? And if you did charter it out, it's always coming back to its home base because you're the owner and you bought the plane for a reason and you want it at your beck and call, and God bless you. But what if we could take that Falcon 50 from the 80s or 90s and put it on the road and have the owner able to schedule when he wants to schedule it, but otherwise he doesn't care if it's in Scottsdale or Peoria or Beef Island, Tortola, because everywhere it's going, it's making money. And in our business model, these planes are cash flowing, contributing to overhead about $3,000 an hour.
That's $3,000 that you're charging retail, and or that's the profit margin that you're getting per hour.
It's really the contribution margin because there's a direct operating cost of $4,000 an hour. Charters out at $7,000 an hour. That's a $3,000 an hour margin. But that's direct operating costs. So that's basically fuel, crew travel expenses, and maintenance.
That's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to getting into a little bit of those numbers in just a minute. So you unpacked a lot of stuff there. I love your perspective on depreciation. That the biggest hit of depreciation has already been taken. You already addressed the acquisition costs. Like these people who are buying private jets, they're high net worth individuals. They understand it's a $2 million, $3 million and up. Kind of an acquisition. So that's one of the reasons I usually tell people not to do it, but people know that if they're looking at possibly doing this, they understand that that's kind of in their day-to-day, that kind of an acquisition. You mentioned it being a mobile asset, and I would tell people, maybe you don't want your jet, right. Maybe you want it right next to you. You don't want it going across the country. But to your point, because it's a mobile asset, it can actually make you more income because it's flexible. It's an asset that can go anywhere it needs to go in order to generate a revenue. So I love that point that you mentioned. Just before we get into kind of your model, one of the last reasons I tell people not to invest in a jet is all the FAA regulations. It's not like, an Airbnb where you can just buy a house, get a renter certificate and then, post it online and off you go. There's a lot of regulations that go into making revenue on your private jet. So maybe speak to, it's not so much like you shouldn't do it. It's just the benefit of working with an operator like yourself because you've already gone through all the paperwork and you see behind the scenes like what's required on the FAA side. Maybe you can speak into that a little bit.
It's not just regulations, Tom. It's there's just a lot that goes into maintaining an asset like this, employing the pilots, having the pilots on your payroll, and maintaining the economic authority from the FAA. So getting back to that car analogy, your car is on a manufacturer's maintenance program. When the service E-light comes up, you're supposed to take it into a dealership or into a service center and they map Service E with a 222 point inspection of items that they do at Service E in order to keep your car safe and roadworthy. The same phenomenon is in private jets, except for it's regulated by the FAA that you must keep your airframe maintained to the manufacturer's maintenance program. So maintenance is calculated both on an hourly basis. So for every hour that the plane flies, um, it brings it closer to certain life limited components and other items that need to be serviced, and also on a time basis. So every X number of months or X number of years, different inspections and overhauls are due. These maintenance tasks are all tracked in a computerized maintenance program that we subscribe to called CAMP, and it's no fool's errand to keep track of that and keep an airplane flying safely and compliant. That's part of what we do as part of our monthly management fee, is provide maintenance administration to keep the planes flying compliantly. But more to your point, Tom, there's a litany of FAA and DOT and NTSB regulations that surround pilots, pilot training schedules, pilot qualifications, pilot drug testing, not to mention the economic authority from the FAA to be able to monetize a charter flight. So there's been some wrangling or some news lately about gray area flights where private owners are loaning out their planes to friends and taking compensation in an informal way. And not only are those flights illegal, but they're unsafe, and they open both the owner and the customer, if you will, the illegal customer, to a great deal of legal jeopardy. That's all unnecessary. All you need to do is sign a lease agreement with a certified Part 135 air carrier such as us, or another one of our brethren, and at that point, our company assumes the operational control of your asset, and we employ, in my organization we employ 100 people, but there are three key personnel who the FAA looks to. It's a director of operations, who is the main man in charge of safety and compliance, a chief pilot, and a director of maintenance. And before every flight is dispatched, those three individuals sign off that the plane is airworthy, the pilots meet the FAA requirements, and there are no operational or safety concerns that would prohibit or preclude us from operating this flight per the operational specs or operating specs that have been issued to our company from the FAA. So, as an owner of a plane, if you don't want to pay for the overhead, and in my business model, a Falcon 50 overhead's about 80 grand a month before we've flown an hour. But if you'd like some economic assistance in that overhead number, and at frankly a positive ROI on your asset, you really have to charter it out. There's no other way to generate anywhere near the amount of revenue that's needed to hit these numbers other than charter. So there's a lot of people that I know who buy a plane for their own use and enjoyment. Anybody who we're talking to, whether they're chartering a plane or whether they're owning a plane for use and enjoyment or owning a plane for profit potential, they're all high net worth individuals. It just depends, what you want your ownership experience to look like, And
Hmm.
if you want it to have a positive financial outcome, you'll talk to a company like ours.
A lot of people will say, conventional wisdom says you cannot make money with a jet, whether it's there's not enough demand for it or the charter companies are going to kill you with fees and maintenance costs and stuff. Conventional wisdom says you can't make money with a jet. What do you say, to that conventional wisdom?
So let's unpack that for a second. There's a few big buckets of cost and expense. One is obviously the asset acquisition. So when you think about that conventional wisdom, most people are they're factoring in buying a late model plane. So if you want to buy a $30 million jet that competes against my $2 or $3 million jet, your cost of capital is going to be way out of whack, and it's very difficult to pencil that out. And if you're going to take that $30 million jet and you're only going to bring it to Bombardier or Dassault Falcon Jet or Gulfstream for service, and you're only going to buy factory OEM parts, and you're going to you're going to hire a local management company. So, say you're in Teterboro and you live in New York, you're going to hire Aircraft Services Group, which is a great, highly reputable New York-based air carrier, to operate it, and they're going to keep it in a hangar there in Teterboro and charge you rent and use their own technicians. And every time that plane flies out of Teterboro, it's going to have to come back, right? Because it's a traditional management model. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you're flying one way from New York to LA, you're not going to call that ASG based super mid-sized jet, because they're going to quote you to return the plane back. So its charter footprint is only for really short stay round trips or short one ways that originate in Metro New York. If you're going to do all those things, there's absolutely no chance that you're going to make a dollar in private air travel. And most people don't buy the
Mm-hmm.
plane to make money. We do everything differently than
Mm-hmm.
that. We manage planes that are fully depreciated. We've covered that. There's an approach for buying overhauled parts and that are 30 cents on the dollar compared to factory OEM parts, and they've been certified and signed off and are as good as new. Um, Probably the biggest nuance to our business model is being a floating fleet operator. So our planes don't return back to a home base. Our planes don't live in a home base. Our owners don't pay monthly hangar rent. The planes live on the road. So
Mm.
by in so doing, we're able to take advantage of the much more frothy one-way market where we charge about 85% of a round trip price for a one-way flight. So it's a little bit less than you would pay that locally based operator to return their plane all the way home, but it's a very healthy margin, and it's a particularly healthy margin when you factor in your cost of capital on the jet, cost of maintenance on the airframe, and the higher rate per hour and the number of hours per month that we can put on a plane when we fly it one way.
Mm.
Because I mean, if you look at our marketplace, Tom, you know that most of the requests from charter customers are one way in nature. High net worth individuals
Mm-hmm.
have a travel pattern that is very conducive to one way travel. And even if their flights are round trip, they're staying in that location for so long that it's not going to make sense to leave a plane there for the opportunity cost. So they're in the one way market. And by being very active players in that one way market, we get I don't know what um, traditional locally based operators are getting these days in monthly charter throughput, because I'm not in that world, but it has to be, 30, 40% less than what we
Mm.
get in our world, um, simply for the fact that we're available for one ways. And we
Yeah.
get 20, 30% more per hour because our planes fly one way. And it costs less to buy them, and it
Yeah.
costs less to maintain them. So this model before COVID made money for all of the factors that I just laid out. So owners were receiving checks before COVID. Our company was profitable before COVID. What's
Wow.
happened since COVID, for all the factors that I just explained? It's hard to lose money when you're flying one way. You have an understanding group of owners who don't need their planes in their backyard. You can make economically oriented, financially astute maintenance decisions. You have a wider swath of pilots, and Falcon 50 and Falcon 900 pilots, frankly, are more common than pilots for later model planes. It's easier to get training slots for classic planes than it is for for a moment we were operating two Challenger 350s, and getting training slots for pilots was a very long waiting list. So it's
I've heard
hard
that
to
guy. Yep.
lose money doing this. But what's happened since COVID is obviously demand is higher, but our pricing power as an air carrier is higher, and that's due to the factor that there's been so much consolidation in our industry. JetEdge was acquired by VistaJet. Travel Management and Red Wing were acquired by Wheels Up. Mountain Aviation was acquired by Wheels Up.
Mm.
So all of these companies, that Delta Private Jets was acquired by Wheels Up. So all of these companies that heretofore serviced that one way on demand niche, they're all gone. The amount of
Mm.
supply in this industry, on demand one way jet charters, is down by more than half since COVID.
Interesting.
So people like us, we're limited in the number of planes that we have. We have nowhere to take our business except for to raise prices.
Mm. Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I'd love to talk about that business structure specifically. So basically, how does it work? Somebody wants to buy a jet, and then you mentioned they lease that back out to you. So, and you talked about operational control. So maybe take us into the business structure.
Certainly. So an owner will acquire an asset, typically through an LLC, where the sole asset of that LLC is the executive business jet. It will then lease that asset to our company, where we assume operational control of the plane. And from that point forward, we are, I should back up for a moment. In addition to acquiring that asset, the owner is paying for the startup expenses of the asset, which include, for example, the annual insurance premium. Um, hiring we hire 4 full-time pilots per airplane in our fleet, and those pilots live all over the country. So we're hiring those 4 pilots and then putting them through flight safety or semi-flight training, which has a substantial cost. And all of those, and then we're subscribing to various databases and navigational charts and other things. So the owner is fronting all of those expenses. It's a traditional asset management model, much like buying a vacation home and hiring a local property management company to manage it and maintain it. When guests leave, they have the cleaning staff come in. If the roof leaks, they go hire a maintenance guy to come down and fix the roof. They're managing the Airbnb listing and the VRBO listing, and applying those monies against the costs, and at the end of every month, giving the owner a statement of costs and expenses. So that's exactly what we do. We provide the owners with, once the asset is flying, a monthly statement of costs versus revenues. And the owners will, some owners have elected to pay a fee into their own account every time that they fly, and others choose not to. And when you choose not to, all that means is that we're incurring costs on your asset for owner flights. So we ended our day in Wilmington, Delaware. The owner's flying out of Teterboro the next day. We're flying from Wilmington to Teterboro, buying $2,500 of the fuel in Wilmington, and paying a landing fee in Teterboro. Say and then we're buying fuel in Teterboro to fly the owner to LA, right? So we've in all that example, we've incurred about $20,000 in expenses, and the owner's not paying those, so those expenses go against no revenue, and
Gotcha.
and that, it's the cash flows of the charter paying customers who are really going to pay for that.
So just so I'm clear, the owner's going to put out the money to buy the aircraft. They're going to lease it back to you. They're going to put it in an LLC. They're going to lease back to you. You're going to have direct operational control. They're going to help. They're going to front the money to get the pilots trained and everything. So I guess my question is, whose credit card's on file? So for the pilot training, it sounds like the owner's credit card's the one, on file. And then once it's up and running, then if it doesn't fly at all and there's hangar costs, there's maintenance costs, who's paying that? Are you charging the owner that directly, or are you guys taking care of it? You're paying the bills, and then you turn back around and say, "Hey, owner, you owe us X amount of dollars."
We don't use owner credit cards, so it's the cash flows of the plane, and at the end of the month, if there's an operating deficit, then it's the owner's responsibility. But we don't actually mechanically use an owner's credit card. But it gets back, Tom, to one of the first questions that you asked is, why shouldn't somebody buy a plane, or why wouldn't somebody buy a plane? Because I'm cognizant of the fact that I've painted a pretty rosy picture for owning a plane in my business model, and maybe it would be helpful to your audience to hear of an example or a story of how this
Sure.
might not work out great in a given month. So pretend that your plane flew into Bozeman, Montana on April 2nd, and the APU blew up when you land in Bozeman, Montana. And not only, I don't know if you know where an APU is located in a Falcon 50, but it's right in the back and right next to the hydraulics and a lot of other really critical components. And
The three engines.
yeah, it's messy, right? And an APU can cost 70 grand on the used APU market, to pretend that it's a catastrophic failure. But it leaked all over your hydraulics, and it's in Bozeman, Montana, where there's not technicians. So we had to airline our own technicians from Buffalo, which is where our maintenance facility is, out to Bozeman, or we had to hire someone from Denver to come up. And long story short, this ended up being a $140,000 3-week long maintenance event, which would be, a good word for that is catastrophic. But it can happen, right? And as an owner, you have to factor these things into your calculus. So not only did it cost you $140,000, but it took 3 weeks. And remember what I said at the beginning of this conversation? It costs about 80 grand a month in overhead for your pilot salaries. Now, some of those are not monthly expenses; they're annual expenses that I'm budgeting, like insurance or crew training. But pretend it was a monthly expense. That's $60,000 in overhead on top of $120,000 in one maintenance event, and we budget $1,000 an hour for airframe maintenance, which over time is a very reasonable conservative number. But in that month, when your maintenance was $120,000 and you flew 0 hours, you flew 2 hours flying into Bozeman, um, the numbers are off the charts, right? So,
That's a
long
great
story
point.
short,
I appreciate that story.
you,
Yeah.
you've accomplished a negative $200,000 outcome that month, and you, as the owner, must have the financial wherewithal to write that check.
That makes sense. How long are the terms usually? I mean, do you usually get a lease back for a year, 3 years, 10 years? Like, what's kind of the term that you see with their lease backs?
Typically a 1 year, but
Okay.
an owner can terminate it with 30 days notice.
And do you see most owners continuing on beyond a year? Like, what's the average lifetime of a client for their lease backs?
Unless they sell the airplane, we haven't had owners leave the program. We've had some owners sell the
Okay.
plane, but again, a $2 to $3 million Falcon 50 in this business model it's worth a lot more to you doing this than it would be
True.
selling it. It's not a particularly frothy market for buying Falcon 50s from the 80s and 90s. Like I said, most people who dream about planes don't dream about this type of plane. It's a great bird. It can do a
Hmm.
lot of things, and it can, from a charter standpoint. One quick commercial about a Falcon 50 is that it has very unique performance capabilities. It can do things that many other planes can't do by virtue of the three engines and the fact that it's so physically light. So it has the same performance capabilities or similar capabilities to a Challenger 300 or a Citation Sovereign, which are the other well-known high-performance super mid-sized jets. So how that manifests to an owner is you get more trips to the Caribbean because people are trying to get to Necker Island through Beef Island, Tortola, or you get more trips out of Aspen, Eagle, Jackson, Wyoming, Telluride, even in the summer months when that
Mm.
hot and high phenomenon and many planes lack the performance to get out of those airports with enough fuel to go anywhere. So you're seeing G4s that fly from Aspen to Denver, they tanker off fuel in Denver, and then they fly on to New York or wherever because they physically can't get out of the mountain range with
That's a
that
great
much
point.
fuel. But a Falcon 50 can. So it in many different types of mission profile. I wouldn't say we're the only game in town, but we're part of a very narrow band of available solution sets. And that drives more utilization through the assets on a all year
Hmm.
round.
Tell us about what the charter market looks like from an owner's perspective in the light jet world.
Certainly. So we focus on mid-sized, super mid-sized, and heavy jets. Um, in the past, we've dipped our toe into the light jet market, and frankly,
Hmm.
what I found is that it's almost as expensive to operate a light jet from an overhead and from a maintenance perspective as it costs for one of these classic airframe mid-sized and super mid-sized jets. So, parts really don't cost that much less. Labor certainly doesn't cost any less. And things seem to break just as often on light
Mm.
jets as they do in super mids. But beyond that, Tom, I think that charter customers like their comfort and like their space, and the market naturally gravitates towards bigger planes to the extent that it's within the budget. But also from one of the things that keeps me up at night is pilot hiring and retention, right? And when you have pilots who are flying a light jet, they make a little bit less than a super mid-sized jet pilot. So I feel like they're looking to upgrade a lot faster, and you run the risk of having more turnover. Because really, if you're a pilot, these are often big guys, and who wants to be, sitting,
Yeah.
squeezing
Yeah.
themselves into a light jet? If in this market, it's still pretty frothy for pilots to be able to go out and find the right opportunity for themselves. And then the third perspective on light jets is just cash flow. So if it costs roughly the same, certainly the same order of magnitude to operate a
Mm-hmm.
light jet, how much cash flow can you really drive through a light jet compared to a super mid-sized jet? They're smaller, they have less range, their footprint is smaller, so a light jet, many of them can't make it from, say, Boston to South Florida. So they're really much more regional plays, and their average live leg flight segment might be 1.0 hours to 1.5 hours. And that compares to our average live leg on a Falcon 50 is 3 hours. Our average live leg on a Falcon
Mm-hmm.
900 is about 4 hours. They just don't operate at the margin that's going to give our owner the outcome that he wants, to the extent that he's looking for an economically oriented outcome.
Right. Yeah. If you think about it, just from those numbers that you just pointed out, if the goal, and I don't know if we talked about this, maybe you want to speak into this, but if the goal is to offset maintenance, we really need to be in the 400-500 hour a year mark. Correct me if I'm wrong, for a plane to be flying. Like, the plane needs to fly a couple hundred hours a year. So if the average leg or the average trip for a midsize is 4 hours, that's 100 trips. Okay, I could see an operator like yourself booking 100 trips in a year. If I now own a light jet, and I need 400 hours a year, I got to book 400 trips if the average trip is an hour long. And so that's a lot bigger of a task to take on from an operator side than simply 100 trips a year. So am
Yeah,
I doing that math right?
yeah,
Does that
and
sound about
and
right?
they're harder trips to sell. People want to be in a
Mm,
mid-sized jet. They want to be in a super mid-sized jet. Um, in a light jet, you're competing a lot against King Airs and Pilatuses
mm-hmm.
that have basically the same size tube. And if you're flying from Boston to New York on a light jet, that might be 50 minutes, and on a Pilatus it might be 65 minutes. But we're then competing against that Pilatus in terms of occupied hourly rate, and it costs a lot less to operate a
Mm,
Pilatus than it does a light jet. So I think it's a quirky spot in the market where it's not that much better than a turboprop. It's certainly a lot worse than a mid-sized or super mid-sized jet. And it doesn't cost that much less to operate it. So when you talk about 400 hours a year, in today's market, no matter what you have, that's very attainable. Our Falcon 50
mm.
fleets running about 1,000 hours a year per plane, including
Wow.
owner usage. So, and that translates to about 80 hours a month. So for us, that's what, about 14 coast to coast trips. So one every other day is going to get us to that number. So it's
Wow.
pretty attainable in a super mid-sized jet. And not for nothing, but the for every hour that you fly a plane, it gets progressively less expensive to operate it for each additional hour. As the plane is flying across the country, it's burning off fuel, and it's flying at a higher altitude, which is more fuel efficient. So while we're getting that same frothy occupied hourly rate for our flights, for every hour that it's flying, it's costing less and less to operate.
Less
So
and less.
so those longer flights are really the money makers from our owner's perspective.
Yeah. No, I can. That's, yeah, I appreciate that. And you only get those kinds of legs with jets that can do that. A very light jet's not going to fly for hours and hours and hours the way a midsize or a heavy is going to fly.
Right, and
What do you have to say about? Oh, sorry.
well, I would just say that we're in the super mid-sized space. We're competing against Citation tens and Citation sovereigns and G200s, right? So these are planes that cost 4 to 10 times as much, but they're also, because of the consolidation in the industry, those are the planes that are the toughest to find. So what we find with a super mid-sized jet is that you often people have the budget for it, but they don't have the lift. And if you can come into that category with high quality product that's available, you're going to win a lot of trips.
What would you say about this idea of markets? If someone's in Fargo, North Dakota, I mean, that's one kind of market, and you would obviously need some kind of a specific model that's going to help, generate revenue. But, you guys are out in Massachusetts, so I imagine kind of like in that Boston market. Can you speak to what owners need to be aware of when placing their jet with an operator and the market or markets that they play in and how that's going to impact the overall ROI for the owners? Because I think that's something that people don't think about, both from the perspective of, maybe I live in Sarasota. So that's one market, that's like a Tampa market. But if I'm okay placing my jet with someone across the state in the Miami market, well, maybe that's going to be a lot better of a ROI. And I'm not even thinking about that. I'm just thinking, well, I'm in Sarasota, so I have to find someone in Sarasota, and I'm tied to the Sarasota market.
Yeah.
Maybe I wonder if all that kind of stirred something that you want to speak into.
So our company is based in Boston. We have a maintenance facility in Buffalo. We have flight operations in South Florida. And we're not in any of those markets per se. We're in the North America charter market, the Americas charter market. And with a floating fleet business model, we are not beholden to any one market. So for that Fargo, North Dakota owner, it would be the road to hell to hire a Fargo-based Part 135 air carrier and base his plane there and expect to get any meaningful charter throughput. However, if that same owner has his plane in our fleet and it's flying here, there, and everywhere, so our planes do not return to a home base after the trip. Right now, we've got planes in 6 different states because last night they dropped off passengers, or this morning they flew into those airports to pick up passengers. We don't go anywhere unless we have paying customers who are paying to bring the plane to them and paying our rates to take the flight. So naturally, our planes gravitate towards the major markets of this country, right? The Northeast, South Florida, the West Coast. And that's where our planes end up being because that's where the customers pay us to bring our planes. But if we had a customer who was paying us to fly into Fargo, North Dakota, we would do that. We would just charge that customer, assuming they're flying one way into Fargo, we would charge them probably a higher repositioning fee to get the plane out of Fargo because that's such a slow market, such a remote market. But we have a really different business model than what you alluded to at the beginning of your question, where you're saying, hey, I would hire a Sarasota or a Tampa-based Part 135. I know a lot of people who do that, and I know a lot of those companies that provide that local market-based service. But in so doing, you're tying your jet to that local market. And in my experience, these markets tend to, they find their equilibrium. So you don't find, it always seems like in every geographic market, there's just about the right number of planes that you would think available for charter out of that market. But in so doing, you're only availing yourself as an owner, as an operator, for the round trip flights out of that market.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
So you're, that 3 to 4, maybe 500 hours a year of utilization is very realistic for that business model, where, that's what most regional air carriers are generating is about 400 hours of charter a year. And we're more than double that because we're playing in the one-way game. And
sense.
it's not to just to put an exclamation point on that. there's this great book. It's called The Blue Ocean Strategy. It talks about how there are markets, and some of these markets are red oceans because of all of these sharks that are just eating each other because there's no differentiation, and they're all playing in the same market. And then there's a blue ocean strategy, which the waters are clean because there's no or fewer competitors, or the competition is irrelevant. So in each market, you
Oh,
find these, in New York, the same seven air carriers are all fighting over those short stay round trips that originate out of New York. Same with South Florida. They're all trying to get those missions. But if you're flying a one way out of New York or a one way out of Florida, and we happen to have a plane that's well positioned, there's going to be a lot less competition for that because every one of those local operators is always quoting to have the plane come back after it drops you off. So their
hmm.
pricing is higher. But in our business model, if we're flying one way, we can charge a much higher hourly rate than that company that's quoting it as a round trip, and still be less because we're flying less hours.
Have you seen, or what do you make of this concept of a race to the bottom when it comes to charters? That the charter market has been so frothy, but there does seem to be signs of a pullback, which I think we've discussed. I don't see it returning to a negative, and we're just finding a new
Yeah.
equilibrium. How do operators? How do you navigate a market that has almost become known for a race to the bottom? And what's maybe something you would caution charter people and owners that when they're looking at these charter rates and it seems to be a race to the bottom with regards to charter rates? Can you speak into any of
Well,
that?
for the last 18 months, it was a race to the top. We were talking about this offline, where the amount of pricing power that operators have enjoyed has been unprecedented. And our owners have gotten used to those rates, and you know, frankly, the costs are so high, and this is such an unforgiving business model where between pilot fees and maintenance and just the cost to leave your plane on a ramp overnight is $400 a night in
I
many
know. Tell
cases.
me about
It's crazy. So
it.
the companies that entertain a race to the bottom pricing strategy, in my worldview, are not going to be here for very long. But the good news
Hmm.
is that I don't see that I don't see that happening. And I'm very plugged
Okay.
into the market, and it certainly has gotten more competitive than in the past. But you
Hmm.
know, we compete with our fleet. We're punching way above our weight. We're competing against planes that have an acquisition or capital cost of 3 to 10 times as much as ours in the same category. So those owners have debt service probably on their machines. Um, they they don't want to put as many out, that 1,000 hours a year that I put on the 1990 Falcon 50. If you had a 2022 Challenger 350, you wouldn't want me putting those hours on that plane because you take a
Exactly.
huge
Yeah.
depreciation
Yeah.
hit. So I like to think that we're well positioned, and that our with the we're asset light. Our owners own our planes, but they want to see consistent charter revenue. Charter is the silent partner in every one of our owners' business models, and you
Hmm.
know a race to the bottom doesn't necessarily need to be a race to the bottom in terms of price, but it can also be, not to suggest that our planes are the bottom of the barrel, because they're certainly not, but a 1990 Falcon 50 that's $2 to $3 million compared to planes that are in the same category that cost way more, it is the bottom. It's
Right.
the lowest point of entry to get into the super mid game is a Falcon 50. Among the lowest ways to get into the mid-sized jet game is a Lear 60. So these planes are available. They want to charter. The owners want to charter them out. They want to put
Right.
that 1,000 hours a year on it. If we can get more hours, they want them, right? So, so
Right.
our business model, as I've explained, gives us a great deal of pricing power because we're often the only game in town for one-way flights. And the market, because all of those later model planes are either still costing, more than they should, or just simply unavailable, there's the market finds us because we are available and because we do want that business
Sure.
and we still have the pricing power.
Sure. Well, Justin, thank you so much for your time on 2 occasions to get this information out to our audience, because it is super powerful. And, the more educated people become, the more able and ready they are to make a decision. So I greatly appreciate that. Where can people find more information about AJAX Jets?
Our website is AJAX Jets, AJAXJETS.com. You can check me out on my YouTube channel at Your Friend with Jets. And if you'd like to send me an email, my email address is justin@ajaxjets.com.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check out theultimatejetguide.com.